In graduate school, I did my PhD dissertation on Mark Twain, and the first article that I published was on an essay that Mark Twain wrote called "The Turning Point of My Life." He talks about walking down the streets of Hannibal one day, and a piece of newspaper blew along the street, and he picked it up, and it said, "Gold discovered in the Amazon." And he said, "I'm going to go." And decided to get on a steamboat and go down to New Orleans, where he was going to catch a boat to the Amazon. On the steamboat, he fell in love with steamboats and decided to become a steamboat captain. So that was one of the turning points in his life. As I look back over my life, I think there are several turning points, but perhaps the first significant one was when I was 3 months old. As I had mentioned, my grandmother and my two aunts had come to California to see me as the newest Rees child, and I have a great kind of fondness for the fact that my grandmother held me when I was an infant, because 3 months later she was tragically killed in an avalanche in the Colorado mountains. She had gone up to the mountains to cook in for a mining company, and an avalanche came down, hit the cabin, killed 5 men who were in the cabin, and killed my grandmother. She wasn't dead when they couldn't find her. She was buried in a lot of snow. When they finally found her, she was still breathing, but by the time they were able to get her out, she had passed away. She was, as my father describes her, a kind of larger-than-life woman. She had come from real hardy stock, and she worked on the farm. My dad said she worked out with my granddad. He said she could out-wrestle any man in the county but granddad. So she was a woman of some strength as well as character and vigor. But her sudden death at the age of 44 was very traumatic for the family. My father and my mother decided to move back to the farm to help my grandfather run the farm. And so they left California and went back. Grandfather couldn't really, it's too difficult for him, so he stopped working on the farm. My dad decided that he would go back to California to try and get more work. And when he got enough work, he sent for my mother and my brother and me to come back, and we did, and we lived together for a period of time. And then things became difficult again, and they went back to Colorado. And then my father went back to California to try and find work again. And one can imagine that people were desperate. There were, I think, something like I don't know how many thousand men just trying to sell apples on the streets of New York. People were trying to find work wherever they could get it. The government finally, under President Roosevelt, began to have programs like the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Works Progress Administration, and others, trying to put people back to work with a number of great government projects. But there was a time when my father worked for the WPA, but during this time he was having a very hard time finding enough meaningful work to survive. He did get work when he moved back to California, and sent for my mother and my brother and me a second time, but my mother wrote and said she thought it would be better if they separated. What my father didn't know at the time was that she was pregnant by another man by the name of Horace Holt. At some point, I'll stop and tell you the story of why my mother was a kind of tragic figure. Maybe this is the time to tell it. I didn't know about my mother's life, her early life, until after she passed away. She was always somewhat of an enigma to me. She wanted to love her children, but seemed in many ways incapable of loving them at least as I think we needed or wanted to be loved. So when first of all, she was depressed when she was pregnant with me and tried to abort me by drinking a bottle of blue poison. That didn't work, and my persistence apparently began in the womb, because I survived that attempted abortion and was born anyway. But when mother was very vulnerable, and I never could figure out why she abandoned her children several times in our infancy and childhood. But after she passed away, I went to visit her sister, my aunt Jessie, and my grandmother, who was in her 90s at the time. And after grandmother went to bed, Jessie said, "Bobby, there's something about your mother that you don't know, but you need to know." And I said, "What?" And I was bracing to hear something that would help me understand my mother. And she said, "From the time your mother was a young girl, our father molested her." And suddenly I saw my mother with a clarity I'd never seen before. It's as if her whole life fell into place like the pieces of a puzzle. And I realized that from an early age she had been broken, and that even when she was a teenager working in the creamery, her father was attempting to molest her. And even as a grown woman, when he visited her, he would sometimes press her. As I say, I could never figure my mother out, but when Jessie told me that story, I realized what had happened and how so much of my mother's life had been shattered by that experience. My wife Ruth and I were visiting Jessie then when we found that out, and we decided we would drive south to southern Colorado to visit my mother's homestead home where she grew up. And she had a cousin, Mavis Peterson, who was very close to mother. And so Ruth and I went to see Mavis, and she told us about, we didn't talk about this experience, but she talked a lot about my mother and showed some pictures of my mother when she was a young girl. I've written a poem about her, which I will read, that kind of talks about this experience. But I remember visiting the homestead and the places where the Hardens grew up. The Hardens were they'd come from North Carolina, moved to Colorado. One of my relatives is John Wesley Hardin, the great outlaw who killed 21 men, and he said they all deserved it, but he was quite a desperado. I've read his autobiography, and I suppose every family has stories of people that have some kind of notoriety, but John Wesley Hardin was, songs have been written about him. Movies have been made about him as a legendary figure. But my mother, as I went around looking at the various places in which she lived, as Mavis told me stories about their growing up, I began to piece together my mother's life. I could never understand why she was sent away from home when she was 15 to go to live with her aunt and uncle in Cortez, but it was because her mother was trying to get her away from her father. So by the time she came to where my father was living, she was already in some ways severely compromised. She was a lovely woman, very beautiful, dark-haired, but always kind of passive in a way, but very gentle. I think some of the gentleness in my own personality comes from my mother. Anyway, I'll get prepared to read a poem I wrote about her when I went to Rye and saw the picture of her in her, I think it was her 6th grade class with her cousin Mavis.